Chapter 9 of Ulysses has taken us into the literary hothouse of the National Library of Ireland, where Stephen Dedalus has taken his stance amid the literati of Dublin. But to find the raw matter of his art, Stephen must leave the library and plunge back into the streets of Dublin again. And that is where we go in Chapter 10 of Ulysses. Out of the library, into the labyrinth of Dublin itself, which plays as vital a part in this story as any of its characters do. This chapter consists of 19 sections, or 18 plus a coda, with each section focusing on a different aspect of Dublin life and many things happening simultaneously within one city, within the Dedelian labyrinth of streets known as Dublin. Anthony Burgess suggests that the whole chapter is conceived spatially, and we're invited to read it with the eye of a surveyor, as though it were a map. We might almost imagine ourselves looking down on the city from the back of a bird or the top of Nelson's column, up there with the two titillated spinsters, looking down on the comings and goings of all of the characters, including many that we meet in this chapter for the first time. So, don't we run the risk of losing Bloom and Stephen in the crowd? And even if we do manage to recognize them here and there, how do we make sense out of all these comings and goings, out of all these little ant people scurrying to and fro? I'm going to answer these questions in reverse order. I'm first of all going to sketch a picture of the chapter as a whole, which is itself a picture of Dublin as a whole, and then I'm going to show how the chapter manages to highlight both Stephen and Bloom as citizens of Dublin. Let's start with the Homeric title of the chapter, Wandering Rocks. This title is something of a joke on the reader, one of many practical jokes that Joyce springs on us as we struggle to follow the wanderings of Leopold Bloom with Homer as our guide. A bit like people staggering through a museum with one eye on the pictures and the other eye on the guidebook. Joyce calls this chapter Wandering Rocks, but there is no Homeric episode about wandering rocks, because Ulysses avoids them altogether on the advice of the enchantress Circe. So the only thing we learn about them is what Circe tells Ulysses when she gives him directions for his homeward voyage. The wandering rocks, or clashing rocks, as they are also called, seem to have been a cluster of rocks looming up in the midst of roaring waves, the kind of rocks that seem to lunge out in front of you because of the water swirling around them. In any case, Circe warns Ulysses that the wandering rocks are impossible to negotiate. All right, so where in this chapter about Dubliners wandering the streets of Dublin can we find parallels to Homer's wandering rocks or clashing rocks? Well, as a matter of fact, the characters in this chapter sometimes bump into each other, literally. In section 17, a blind stripling tapping along with his cane is rudely buffeted out of the way by an eccentric old man. A few pages earlier, as Martin Cunningham is about to enter a wine bar with several other men, the doorway is filled and blocked by a tall sub-sheriff named Long John Fanning, who makes no way for them. This is a chapter of obstructions, frustrations, small collisions, characters running up against each other like bumper cars that bounce off each other and go their separate ways. The stripling and the eccentric old man collide just outside the office of a dentist named Bloom. But he's no relation to Leopold, even though their names bump into each other. One way of ordering all these characters, making some sense out of them, is to see them laid out on a map drawn from the world of Homer's epic. Homer's wandering rocks are generally thought to have stood in the Bosphorus, that little strip of water between Greece and Turkey, or in other words, between Europe and Asia. Stuart Gilbert suggests that Dublin's River Liffey corresponds to the Bosphorus. Dubliners, he says, are like the archipelago of wandering rocks caught between Europe and Asia, with Asia signified by the spiritual identity of the priest in section 1, and Europe represented by the material glory of the viceroy, the embodiment of the British Empire in section 19 at the very end of the chapter. Let's pursue Gilbert's point a little further. Whether or not the first and last sections of this chapter can be made to stand respectively for Asia and Europe, they certainly invite comparison with each other. For each of these two sections tells the story of a journey through Dublin that is made for a quite specific purpose. In section 1, a Jesuit priest named Father Conmee travels by foot and tram to the O'Brien Institute for Destitute Children on the northeast outskirts of the city. He goes there in hopes of finding a place for Master Dignam, one of the sons of the late Paddy Dignam, who has obviously not left much in the way of a legacy. In the final section, a comparable mission of mercy is undertaken by the Viceroy, the man who stands for the King of England and thus embodies British power in Dublin. In a cavalcade of carriages, the Viceroy and his party travel from the Vice-Regal Lodge in Phoenix Park, where he lives, to the southeast outskirts of the city, where the Viceroy will inaugurate the Mirrors Bazaar in the aid of funds for the Mercers Hospital. So, both men, the Viceroy and Father Conmee, both men travel for a philanthropic purpose. And superficially, each one seems to be wisely exercising the power that he holds. The spiritual power of a priest, the material, political power of the Viceroy. All, it would seem, exercised on behalf of the people of Dublin. But when you look closely, you see how ineffectual their powers are, and how irrelevant they themselves are to the lives of the people they are supposed to be supervising, politically and spiritually. First of all, we never learn whether or not Conmee actually finds a place for the Dignam boy, because the section devoted to his journey ends before he reaches the Institute. That's a recurrent feature of this novel. It's full of stories that don't have endings, at least not in any conventional sense of resolution. So we don't follow Conmee to the Institute, nor do we follow the Viceroy and his party to the bazaar, or learn anything about how much money was raised for the hospital. In other words, we don't see either of these men actually completing a mission of mercy. Secondly, and more importantly, sections devoted to each of these men show just how little sway they have over the people they are supposed to lead and guide spiritually and politically. Father Conmee means well, but he firmly deflects any serious demand on his sympathy. He wears his bland optimism like a suit of armor against any darts of misfortune that other people might throw in his way, so that the darts simply bounce off it. We see this clearly because we actually get inside his head to learn what he's thinking, something up to now we've done only with Bloom and Stephen. When a crippled sailor jerking along on his crutches holds out his cap for a coin, Father Conmee gives him only a blessing and then thinks, but not for long, of soldiers and sailors maimed by cannonballs and ending up in some pauper ward. This troubling thought drops away as soon as he sees coming toward him the wife of Mr. David Sheehy, Member of Parliament. After chatting with her about her husband and her children and the beautiful weather, he goes on his happy way. And when he passes a bargeman seated in a turf barge moored to the south bank of the Royal Canal, he finds the whole scene idyllic and providentially ordered. Never mind the crippled sailor desperate for a penny. Never mind the army of mutilated veterans rotting in the pauper wards. Never mind the misery of a bargeman's life or the back-breaking labor of digging turf all day. For Father Conmee, as for Voltaire's Candide, all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. This sense of radical disconnection recurs when we turn from the impenetrable optimism of Father Conmee to the grandeur of the Viceroy and his cavalcade in the very last section of the chapter. The would-be topic sentence, that term perhaps from your study of writing, a topic sentence, the main point of this final paragraph, would-be topic sentence that seems to state its main point is this: the Viceroy was most cordially greeted on his way through the metropolis. But as you work your own way through this section of the chapter, you find that the Viceroy is cordially greeted by almost no one. A number of people described in this section don't even notice the viceroy, or don't bother to greet him, or greet him only with their backsides, as in the very last lines, where he is saluted by the trousers of a man who has just boarded a tram car with the door closing on him. One of the striking things about this section, in fact, is that inanimate objects like trousers turn out to be just as important for human beings, just as important as human beings. For my money, the gem of this whole section is a sentence explaining how the viceroy and his party are saluted by a river. To catch the full force of this sentence, you have to know that on high days and holidays in European cities, great long colored streamers are customarily hung out of top-story windows. With that in mind, picture this exquisite salute to the viceroy. From its sluice in Wood Quay Wall under Tom Devon's office, Pottle River hung out in fealty a tongue of liquid sewage. If ever an Irish city could express by a single act just what it feels, Pottle River speaks for Dublin here, vomiting out its contempt for British rule. So, here's a chapter of 19 sections, bookended by sections devoted to spiritual and political leaders who failed to lead, failed to serve or guide or govern the people of Dublin in any significant way. As we wander through this city, as we stumble through its labyrinth of wandering rocks, we ask ourselves, who's in charge here? Who's running the show? No one person seems to dominate the chapter. And even the journeys undertaken by Conmee and the viceroy are parodied, so to speak, by the voyage of a piece of paper down the River Liffey, the voyage of a crumpled throwaway announcing the coming of Elijah in the person of a preacher named J. Alexander Dowie. Back in chapter 8, you remember Bloom tossed the throwaway into the River Liffey, and this chapter follows the progress of the throwaway just as carefully as it follows the progress of the viceroy and his party, as if both journeys were equally important or equally unimportant. Now, if the mindless voyage of a crumpled sheet of paper down the River Liffey can take its place in this chapter with the journeys of a priest and a viceroy, where can we find a true sense of order, a true sense of purpose? We seem to be living in a world driven by machinery, such as the tram car ridden by Conmee, the whirring dynamos of the powerhouse that urged Stephen to be getting on, the little gadget invented by a bookie named Tom Rochford, even the collar that Master Dignam struggles with as it keeps popping up. In fact, the whole organization of the chapter might be called mechanical, because if you read them carefully, you find that the separate sections of the chapter interlock like a system of cog wheels. Section 8, for instance, tells about Ned Lambert conducting a tour of St. Mary's Abbey. But in the middle of this section comes a sentence that obviously describes something happening elsewhere. The young woman with slow care detached from her light skirt a clinging twig. This is the young woman briefly encountered by Father Conmee at the end of section 1. The young woman coming out from behind a hedge with her flushed young man. When we find her once again detaching the twig from her dress in section 8, we see two things happening at once in different parts of Dublin. While Ned Lambert is conducting his tour, the young woman is hand-cleaning her skirt. So this is a chapter of many things happening in various parts of Dublin as various characters go their own way with the great machine of the city turning its wheels. But if the chapter offers us a whole new cast of characters, and if a brand new character like Conmee gets to have his own interior monologue, what happens to the main characters of the novel? Do Stephen and Bloom get lost in the shuffle, indistinguishable now from all the others wandering the streets of Dublin and bumping into each other? To that question, I have one simple answer, and the answer is no. Stephen and Bloom don't get lost at all. We see them even more clearly in this chapter as citizens of Dublin with their own distinctive personalities. Let's consider, first of all, the way Bloom turns up in section 9, which mostly offers us a conversation between two men we've met before, namely Lenehan and McCoy. Bloom takes no part in their conversation. But when Lenehan spots him looking over books on a hawker's cart, the two men start talking about his interest in books and astronomy. And Lenehan tells a story to illustrate this. Coming home one winter night from a fancy dinner in Glen Cree, about 10 miles south of Dublin, Lenehan rode in an open car with back-to-back seats. Beside him on one seat sat Molly Bloom, while Bloom himself sat on the other seat with another man named Chris Callanan, both of them facing the other way. Okay? Bloom and Lenehan back to back. Lenehan loved this arrangement. He's right beside Molly. Bumping against Molly with every jolt of the car, seizing every chance he could get to tuck the blanket around her ample curves and settle her feathered boa, Lenehan thoroughly enjoyed what he called this gamey mare. This gamey mare of a woman who, as he puts it, made his lad stand to attention. Meanwhile, Leopold was looking up at the stars and explaining, as Lenehan says, the whole jing-bang lot, until Molly asked about a tiny one far off. Now hear Lenehan. By God, she had Bloom cornered. That one, is it? Says Chris Callahan. Sure, that's only what you might call a pinprick. By God, he wasn't far of the mark. Lenehan almost collapses with laughter at his own joke, at his own story about Bloom's blindness to what Lenehan was doing with Molly right behind Bloom's back. And yet the fascinating thing about this story is that it doesn't just end with a laugh at Bloom's expense. When Lenehan recovers from his laughter, he thinks about Bloom's knowledge of the stars, and he feels bound to admit that Bloom is anything but a fool. In all seriousness, then, Lenehan says to McCoy, he's a cultured all-round man, Bloom is. He's not one of your common or garden. You know, there's a touch of the artist about old Bloom. Coming as it does at the very end of Section 9, this comment makes Bloom stand out for two reasons. One, it's the first time anyone in the book has spoken so highly of Bloom, who has up to now been generally slighted by other people. Secondly, Bloom's all-roundedness takes even Lenehan by surprise. You see, when Lenehan starts to tell his story, he's telling a joke on Bloom. He wants to laugh at the picture of Bloom with his head in the stars while his wife is fooling around with another man. But in the end, Lenehan catches himself. Bloom isn't just a ridiculous cuckold. He's a cultured man, a man of wide reading, wide interests, wide information, an uncommon man wandering these Dublin streets. In a word, Bloom stands out. Part of what makes Bloom stand out is precisely the complexity that takes Lenehan by surprise. And we can see this complexity by contrast with the simple-mindedness, or rather single-mindedness, of Bloom's rival, Blazes Boylan. As Hugh Kenner points out, Boylan is a simple character driven by just one motive, a caricature of the lady-killing man about town. He plays this role to perfection in Section 5. With his straw hat, his indigo serge suit, his sky blue tie, and his new tan shoes, he is the picture of a man on the make. And when he goes to a fancy fruit shop to buy from Molly a basket of fat pears and ripe, shamefaced peaches bedded in rustling fiber, we know exactly what he's looking forward to, bedding down with Molly's own succulent curves, with Molly's own fat pears and ripe peaches. In other words, Boylan's character and motivation are simple, straightforward, and blindingly clear. Bloom is much more complicated. Suppose for a moment that Joyce were writing just another version of the old story in which a rich and grasping husband is outwitted by his lovely young wife and her handsome young lover. What would Bloom be? He would be the goat of this novel, the butt of all its jokes, the blind old fool, the ridiculous cuckold. But Bloom isn't blind at all. He's known for hours what Boylan plans to do with Molly at 4 o'clock today, and he has struggled to live with this knowledge. So the contrast between Boylan and Bloom cannot be reduced to a contrast between smart young lover and blind, stupid, possessive old husband. We can see this best, perhaps, by following up on the implications of a single sentence from the section devoted to Boylan. a dark-backed figure under Merchant's Arch, scanned books on the hawker's cart. The dark-backed figure is not Boylan, who is just now in the fruit shop, but rather Leopold Bloom, still dressed in the black suit that he wore for Dignam's funeral. Stuck into the middle of Boylan's section, the sentence tells us that while Boylan is buying fruit for Molly, Bloom is shopping for books. And when we get to Bloom's own section, we learn just whom he is shopping for. Not for himself this time, but for guess who? That's right, Molly. Both Bloom and Boylan are buying presents for Molly. While Boylan has luscious fruits sent to her as a herald of his own arrival, Bloom buys a book for her. And it's a peculiar sort of book, a soft porn novel entitled Sweets of Sin. Of all things, this novel tells the all too familiar story of a woman who cheats on her husband. Bloom reads just a few sentences to pick up the gist of the story. All the dollar bills her husband gave her was spent in the stores on wondrous gowns and costliest frillies. For him, for Raoul. Her mouth glued on his in a luscious, voluptuous kiss, while his hands felt for the opulent curves inside her déshabillé. You get the idea fast enough. And so does Bloom, because he promptly buys this book for Molly. Now, what does this purchase tell us? We know exactly what Boylan's purchase of the fruit tells us about him. But what does Bloom's purchase of a soft porn novel tell us about him? Why does he buy Sweets of Sin for Molly? Well, first of all, he knows it's exactly the kind of thing she likes to read. Back in chapter 4, after asking Bloom to explain a word in the sleazy novel she'd been reading, she said that there was nothing smutty in the book, as if she had expected smut and was disappointed not to get it. So Bloom buys the sort of book that he thinks she will like, even if it is soft porn. In doing so, he shows again in his own peculiar way that he has a touch of the artist about him, that he can judge literature at a certain level. He admires the plays of Shakespeare, as we've already seen, but he also knows the kind of books that Molly likes. And rather than trying to reform her taste, he strives to gratify it, to please her, because he really does care about her, as we should know by now. He knows very well that Molly likes sexual intercourse, and he knows only too well and too painfully that for more than 10 years he has failed to provide it. He knows, too, that any normal, healthy woman married to a sexually unresponsive man is sooner or later bound, at the very least, to fantasize about taking a lover. So the least he can do for the woman he loves is to feed that fantasy, to let her feel vicariously the wicked thrill of adultery, to taste the sweets of someone else's sin. At the same time, to read about the heroine and her husband and her lover in the soft porn novel is to see how radically different their lives are from those of Molly and Bloom and Boylan. Even though Molly will actually taste the sweets of sin with Boylan this afternoon, and even though she thus seems to reenact the story of the soft porn heroine, she will ultimately feel repelled by Boylan and drawn again to Bloom, as we will see later on. Right now, we can see that Bloom is nothing like the stereotypical cuckold, nothing like the odd man out in a story of adulterous love, nothing like the dumb and hoodwinked husband. He's a man struggling with agonizing conflict, with his yearning to gratify Molly's sexual needs, with his fear of begetting yet another doomed son, with his knowledge of what another man will inevitably do with his wife today at 4 o'clock in his own house, in his own bed. Now, you might wonder at this point why Bloom hasn't long ago solved his problem by using condoms. They were readily available at the time, because in chapter 14, as we'll see, the lusty young men who gather at the hospital talk about condoms at length. I cannot explain, and I will not even try to speculate about why Bloom never uses condoms. I can only say that the thought of doing so never crosses his mind. For better or for worse, Bloom simply assumes that sexual intercourse always entails the risk of pregnancy, more precisely of begetting a doomed son. And that is a risk that for more than 10 years he has been unable to bear. But If Bloom draws back from begetting another doomed son, what of his would-be surrogate son? What of Stephen in this chapter of Wandering Rocks? Well, Stephen never crosses the path of Bloom in this chapter. Once again, the meeting that we want and wait for and expect to happen is deferred. But Stephen plays a leading role in two sections of this chapter, and in the first of those sections, he's doing exactly what Bloom is doing elsewhere, scanning the books on a hawker's cart. While there, he meets his poor, shabbily dressed sister Dilly, who tells him that the family has pawned some of his books to raise a little of the money they desperately need. Curiously enough, Stephen offers her not 1 penny of the nearly £4 he has in his pocket. All he can see in her is yet another drowning woman like his mother, yet another drowning woman that he cannot save and from whom he yearns to be free. Yet elsewhere in this chapter, the passing of money from one hand to another defines the relations between characters, for better or worse. On the one hand, the crippled sailor who gets nothing at all from Father Conmee gets a coin flung out at him by the plump, generous arm of Molly Bloom, who evidently believes, like old St. Peter, that charity covereth a multitude of sins. In another section, Bloom himself is praised by Martin Cunningham for giving 5 shillings, about $30 in today's money, to the bereaved family of Paddy Dignam. On the other hand, Simon Dedalus gives very little to his own poor children. All that Dilly can squeeze out of him is 1 shilling and 2 pennies, even though we find in the very next chapter that he has the means to buy a drink for himself. Since the death of Stephen's mother, the Dedalus family has all but disintegrated. Simon calls his daughters an insolent pack of little bitches and angrily predicts that they wouldn't care if he were dead. "He's dead," Simon imagines them saying. "He's dead. The man upstairs is dead." Commonly, the man upstairs is slang for God, who is typically portrayed as a father. If Simon Dedalus might as well be dead because he has abdicated his paternal responsibilities, because he has forsworn his duty to provide for his family, then his children might well wonder whether any father at all, human or divine, is watching over them. Thus we return, as if by magnetic force, to the topic of fatherhood and the question of Stephen's quest for a father. By implication, this question surfaces in section 6, where Stephen's music teacher presses him to become a professional singer, and thus tries to take something like paternal charge of his life. As a matter of fact, Joyce himself had a fine tenor voice. In his early 20s, he briefly studied with the best voice teacher in Dublin, who thought he had extraordinary promise. But Joyce would not be trained to sing, and it's his resistance to the siren song of a singing career that is dramatized in the conversation between Stephen and his music teacher, Almedano Artefoni. They talk in Italian, the language of opera, as if Artefoni were tempting Stephen away from his native tongue, which is inescapably English in spite of his Irish blood. The music teacher warns him that he is sacrificing himself if he fails to become a singer, giving up all the money he could make from concerts. But just as Stephen spurns the easy money that he might earn from journalism, he also spurns the temptation to make his living as a singer, for he knows full well that he could do so only by sacrificing his ambition to write. So what happens in this chapter? How can we sum it up? Officially, a priest and a viceroy perform missions of mercy that take them from one part of Dublin to another, but without notably affecting, for better or for worse, anyone else. Bloom buys a soft porn novel for Molly, while Boylan buys fruit for her. Each pays tribute to Molly on his own terms. The Dedalus family is falling apart, and Stephen can find no surrogate father in his music teacher, who speaks a language of temptation, who sings a siren song of musical careerism that would sabotage Stephen's literary ambitions if he heeded it. Having wandered through Dublin, having seen its various characters bumping up against each other like clashing rocks, we are now more than ready for a drink and a song and a bite at the Ormond Hotel, which is where we will go in Chapter 12.